First of all, welcome everybody to this WINIR debate. WINIR is an organization that is focusing on institutional change and institutional research, and it's multidisciplinary, covering economics, political science, sociology, economic history, etc. And today we're going to have an interesting panel discussion or debate about how we measure institutions. We perhaps all agree that institutions matter, but how do we sort of capture them? How do we get to them? And to discuss this, I have with me Stefan Voigt from University of Hamburg. I've got Niels Petersen from University of Münster, and Adam Chilton from University of Chicago. So I welcome all three of you to this nice and interesting debate that we're going to have. A few formal things before we start off with the first speaker is that we are going to start with the first half an hour of presentations. After that, we have a debate and discussion between the three panelists, and then we open the floor for discussions. When you want to ask a question, just raise your hand in Zoom. We are not going to use the chat function, so it's only through the actual raising your hand function that we will be able to get the questions. I should also say that we are recording this, and that this is later on going to then be also put up on the WINIR website, and that it's a YouTube movie or clip or whatever you call it, whatever these modern people call it. But without much further ado, I'm going to leave the word to Stefan. So please, Stefan.
Well, thanks very much for organizing this in the first place, and secondly, thanks very much for inviting me, for having me on this panel. This is actually a topic that's been very close to my heart, so I'm really glad that you picked me as one of the discussants. Let me try to, if this works, to make a couple of points. So as you can see, this is actually two maps of Italy. And the left side, the map on the left side basically depicts differences in per capita income, obviously between the north and the south. The farther down to the south you go, the lower productivity and per capita income in Italy. And on the right-hand side, basically you see unemployment rates. So essentially you see pretty much the same thing. And this in a sense is astonishing, or is amazing, if you take into consideration that Italy has been united for more than 150 years. So in other words, the formal institutions, the laws, the legislations, so to speak, of Italy has been the same, no matter whether you are in Milano or Torino in the north, or Bari or Palermo in the south. So the question is, how can we explain these differences? And obviously one candidate would be informal institutions. And actually, this is a quote by Douglas North that basically points out how important informal institutions might be and how difficult it is, or it seems to be, to measure them. And I will not read it out because it takes too long. So Italy is one case, but there are obviously many other cases in which informal institutions, if they are important, have played or might be playing an important role. This refers to colonizers, imperial states, modernizers, reformers. Many of them have failed, and they might have failed because they might have neglected the prevalent informal institutions. And in order to know whether this conjecture holds true, whether it does hold any water, we would need to measure institutions, to measure informal institutions and make them comparable. Now, how to delineate institutions? There have been many attempts to define institutions, and I prefer this definition here, according to which institutions are commonly known rules used to structure recurrent interaction situations endowed with a sanctioning mechanism. So in other words, institutions consist of rules on the one hand and sanctions in case rules have not been complied with on the other. Now, if you want to sort of fine-tune institutions a little more than, say, institutions and all the rest, non-institutions, you can basically start by looking at the rule part, or you can start by looking at the sanctioning part. And in essence, I propose to do both here. So if you are familiar with the distinction by Doug North, he distinguishes between formal versus informal institutions and focuses on the rule part. This is one way of doing it, but it's not the only way of doing it. What you can also do is look at the sanctioning part and to ask who, in case a rule has not been complied with, is supposed to be doing the sanctioning. Is it the police, prosecutors, judges, prison guards, and so on? So in other words, is it representatives of the state? In that case, I would talk of an external institution because these guys are external from society. But institutions can also be enforced, or the sanctioning can also be done by members of society. That is by my colleagues, my friends, my neighbors, my family, and so on. And if that is the case, I would be talking of internal institutions. And what I want to focus here is how to measure, possibly, what I refer to as social norms, that is informal rules that are sanctioned internally. And I think this is basically really the most relevant and the most difficult challenge, if you want, in measuring institutions. So why should we start any place below the most challenging one? So just one or two ideas why these social norms might matter, why we should be interested in them in the first place. In other words, what could their functions be? And I propose to define two such functions. One would be that they could enable individuals to coordinate their behavior with each other. That is more or less bilaterally. You exchange goods, you say hello when you pass by on the street, etc. And the other function would be that they enable individuals to provide themselves with public goods. In other words, that they make some sort of collective action possible. And I'm highlighting one specific kind of public good here because I think it's very important. The public goods that might be provided by relying on social norms might include the monitoring of politicians. You know, in case politicians overstep the formal constraints that they are supposed to be bound by, there might be opposition. But producing opposition basically makes some sort of collective action necessary, and some social norms might be conducive to doing that. And this idea basically shows us that social norms can have a direct effect, enable individuals to coordinate with each other informally, but they can also have an indirect effect in the sense that they make politicians accountable, that they increase the likelihood that politicians basically play by the rules they are supposed to be playing by. Okay, so this is one way to think about why they might be relevant. Now, here's another quote from another Nobel laureate, namely from Ostrom, who basically says, well, oftentimes people who are used to these informal institutions don't even notice that they are there and that they are basically following that. And in other words, if social science people come in from outside, they will have difficulty in describing, delineating, ascertaining them. And here is a list of difficulties that we are basically confronted with when we try to ascertain social norms. Let me just talk about the first 2 or 3 bullet points. I guess I don't have the time to go through all of them. So if they are not formalized, writing down the relevant rule might be difficult. Then some completely different aspect here. It's unlikely that social norms or the groups relying on them are congruent with nation state borders. So in other words, there might be 3 or 4 or 5 groups within a single nation state following different social norms. So delineating who belongs to a group and who does not is also a challenge. Yeah, and so on. I guess you can read quicker than I can talk. So you've probably seen the other bullet points already. So what can possibly be done to get a better understanding of informal institutions of social norms? And my idea is that experiments could be very useful, both in the lab as in the field, for a number of reasons that I believe are pretty straightforward, namely that they focus on behavior and not on attitudes. Behavior would be incentivized, the environment can be controlled for, the functions can be specified, and they can be played with precisely defined groups below the nation state level. Now, running experiments like in 180 nation states, or if the number of groups within the nation states is larger than whatever 800-900 different groups the world over, is really, really challenging. It's not only really expensive, but it's also it's going to be really, really challenging. So the question is there anything else that we can do beyond running all these experiments? And actually, there is an interesting paper that appeared a number of years back in the Quarterly Journal of Economics by Armin Falk and co-authors. So what they did is they had a number of experiments basically played by the same group of people who also answered survey questions. And then what they did is they basically matched those answers to the survey questions that best predicted the real behavior in the experiment later on. So in other words, what they are doing is a sort of a renaissance of surveys, which is sort of experiment-based. So this seems to be an interesting sort of, if you want, methodological innovation, which might get us to be measuring social norms quicker and for a larger group of countries or groups than relying on experiments in a traditional way. Now, one additional idea or one additional aspect, when we talk about social norms, you often assume that they're largely time invariant. This is an assumption that can often be read or heard, but the question is, how can we test it? I mean, we cannot run a world values survey for 200 years ago. So the question is, what can be done in order to be more confident that, yes, at least some social norms really do not change so much over time. And also in the Quarterly Journal of Economics last year, there was an interesting paper by Michalopoulos and Tsui, who basically relied on fairy tales. So the idea is that fairy tales basically contain many of the relevant social norms that people have been following many years ago. Now, also this question, this paper is not without shortcomings. In reality, they really measure the motives, the headlines of fairy tales rather than their content. But I think it's an important and interesting first step. So let me conclude with two thoughts. Now, imagine that when we apply many experiments, we run many surveys, and we know a lot more about social norms a number of years down the road. And I think what's important to take into account then is that measurement does not imply the capacity to change. It seems that many social norms are really time invariant. They might be determined by geographic, climatic, etc. Conditions. And if it's true that formal and informal institutions shouldn't be conflicting each other, then one possible policy consequence could be that we sort of modify the formal institutions such that they are in line with the informal ones rather than the other way around. Okay, so this is one possible policy implication. The other very last idea that I want to raise is that I've talked about sort of the most challenging issue in front of us, namely measuring social norms. It seems that measuring formal institutions would be a lot easier. After all, we have text, and we can look at text, we can quantify code text, etc. But here we also have one major issue, which then unfortunately makes things messy again, namely that oftentimes de jure, the text, the black letter law, is not equivalent to what is being implemented by politicians and their administrations. So at the end of the day, we'll be, there's a need to look at the way that formal institutions are being implemented de facto, at least if the conjecture is that at the end of the day, it's the de facto implementation of institutions that causes the effects that we are interested in rather than the paper that they're written on. And so much from my side for the moment.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Should we just move on to you now, Niels?
Thank you, Tobias, and thank you for the invitation and for the opportunity to be able to talk to you. I want to focus in my talk on challenges in measuring institutions, and I will focus on formal institutions. But I believe some of the challenges in measuring formal institutions is that you can't really make such a strict difference between formal and informal institutions. I think Stefan has already pointed out in his presentation that some of the formal institutions rely on informal institutions. And this is probably some of the challenge in measuring them. And I would like to focus just to take a concrete example on democracy, which is at the same time a very challenging concept, of course, to define and to measure. But at on the other hand, it's also a very central institution that we want to be able to measure. So I will make 3 points. First, I will look at advantages of measuring institutions. Second, I will look at abstract challenges, and third, I want to highlight certain attempts that are already done to measure democracy and look at the challenges that these attempts have. Of course, in 7 minutes, I can only give a brief, make some brief points. So first, I guess if we are able to measure institutions, that would be extremely valuable because it lets us, it allows us an easy aggregation of data that would not be possible with only qualitative information. Let's look at democracy. If we can quantify the quality of democracy in all states, then we can see trends in democracy. So we can see whether the average democratization score of countries goes up or down. And this shows us larger trends in the development of democracy globally. But we can also use these democracy indicators for quantitative analysis, because then we can see whether the absence or presence of democracy has maybe an influence on economic development, on adherence to human rights, on all kinds of other institutions, which we wouldn't be able to do if we weren't able to quantify democracy. And that's why there are multiple attempts to quantify democracy. But now let's look second at the challenges. And the challenge starts with defining what democracy is. So first, is democracy a binary or a gradual concept? So do we have either democracies and non-democracies, or is it a gradual concept that we can say states are either more or less democratic? Second, we also have to see what the core of democracy is. So probably democracy involves free and fair elections. On that we can agree, even though it's probably less certain what's actually the characteristic of free and fair elections. So what makes elections free and fair? And then secondly, what about other institutions that we find in Western rule of law abiding democracies? Are these also necessary elements of a democracy, or are they something else? Like, do we need freedom of expression? Do we need the guarantee of certain liberties? Do we need the rule of law? And there's probably not a right or wrong answer to any of these definitional questions. But I would like to point out that we might have, depending on which definition we choose, we have different, we look at different institutions. So if we just look at a core democracy, a core electoral democracy, we have a different institution than if we look at a broad definition of democracy that also includes guarantees of civil liberties, freedom of expression, and rule of law. And we have to be aware of these different definitional choices. And now I want to highlight this by looking at three different conceptualizations of democracy that are actually used by quantitative indicators that have been used in the empirical literature to quantify democracy. So first, there's an attempt by Adam Przeworski and colleagues in a monograph from 2000, where he tried to measure first the interrelation between democracy and economic development. So does economic development lead to democracy, and the other way around, does democracy lead to economic development? I don't want to focus on the research question, but I want to focus on his measurement of democracy, because interestingly, Przeworski uses a binary concept of democracy. So either there are democracies or there are no democracies. And he uses a minimalist concept of democracy. So he focuses on free and fair elections, but he doesn't look at other institutions like freedom of expression, rule of law, or other civil liberties. Now, the second indicator is the Freedom House indicator, freedom in the world, which uses a gradual concept of democracy and civil liberties, because they focus on both democracy and civil liberties, and they provide a score of 0 to 100 for each state, and they look at electoral guarantees, freedom of expression, rule of law, personal autonomy, individual rights, and then we have a third indicator, and this is the Polity 5 index, which also has a gradual concept, which measures democracy and autocracy from -10 to 10. If you're under -5, then it's an autocracy. Between -5 and +5, it's an anocracy. And if you have a score greater than +5, you have a democracy. And interestingly, in comparison to the Freedom House indicators, they focus more on democratic institutions like competitiveness and openness of executive recruitment, constraint of chief executive, competitiveness of political participation. So you see, we have three different indicators and very different choices in defining democracy. And beyond definition, of course, we have a challenge in measuring these institutions. So how do you measure civil liberties? How do you measure constraint on chief executive? Do you just look at the rules in the book? Do you also look at informal rules? Do you look at informal constraints? And how do you weigh these factors to each other? So how important is the focus on electoral democracy, on freedom of elections? How important are other civil liberties? So these are all choices. These are all choices that you have to make, and these choices, of course, influence the indicator that you get in the end. Now, I would like to have a brief look at the Polity 5 indicator, just to look at some of the problems, and want to focus on two countries here. And the first is the United States, and the second is Hungary. So the Polity 5 score for the United States went from +10, which is the perfect score in 2015, to +8 in 2016, to +5, which basically isn't a democracy anymore, but an anocracy in 2020. And then after the 2020 election, so in 2021, it went back to +8. Of course, this mirrors some of the political developments in the United States. But of course, we have to ask ourselves whether this jump from +5 to +8, which is probably due to having a different president of the United States at the moment, really captures the underlying problems of US democracy, which is the high polarization that we observe, and that one party doesn't seem to be committed, absolutely committed to democracy anymore. So we still have the danger the danger that we had after the 2020 elections probably has not totally gone away, but will reappear in future elections. I hope to be too pessimistic here, but we will see how this will play out. Second is Hungary. Hungary had a score of +10, so perfect score in 2018. And if we have looked, I mean, this is 2018, the latest number that I got. But if we look at the recent elections in Hungary, the problem is partly with the formal institutions. So we have gerrymandering, which gives the current ruling party a disproportionate advantage in the elections. But some is also with informal rules like dominance of the press in Hungary, which also gave the ruling party a disproportionate advantage in the elections. And these mechanisms or these features of the Hungarian democracy don't seem to have been captured by this Polity 5 index. So I think my time is up. That's why I want to conclude here. So by looking at the at measuring democracy, I just wanted to point out the difficulties that we face even when measuring formal institutions. And I don't say that these are absolute obstacles to measuring institutions. They are certainly not. But I think we have to be very transparent in what we are doing when we are measuring institutions, and not just be seduced by the objectivity of the numbers, what we sometimes see in the public discussion when we look at the objective measuring of institutions. But we really have to look behind the measurement and be aware how they came about. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And so now we've had informal and moving into informal, or from informal to formal institutions, seeing similar problems perhaps, but let's invite Adam in.
Everyone, thanks for having me. Can you see the slides now?
Yes, thank you.
We're great. Okay, cool. All right, so I wanted to start by talking about one of my favorite books, which is written by my colleague here at the University of Chicago, Jim Robinson, and his longtime collaborator at MIT, Darren Asamoglu. I think probably anyone that's worked in this area for any amount of time has come across and engaged with this book, Why Nations Fail. But perhaps part of the reason that I like the book so much is the place that the book starts in the introduction is with an example and a case study from the exact part of the world that I'm from, which is from Arizona, and specifically the Arizona-Mexico border. Now, in Why Nations Fail, the book starts by telling the story of Nogales. So Nogales is the community that perfectly straddles the border between Arizona and Sonora, Mexico. Now, this community, part of the community is on the American side of the border, part of the community is on the southern side of the border. And for the purposes of studying the impact of the drivers of economic growth, it has some nice properties as a case study, which is that the population is largely the same in terms of their background, their ethnicity, their racial composition, etc. The climate is obviously the same on both sides of the border. A few feet on this one side of the wall or another doesn't make a difference. It's hot either way. The rainfall's the same, the animal burden's the same. All of these different features are largely identical. But despite the fact, the two sides of the wall are radically different. So for instance, at the time that they wrote the book, which is now a dozen years ago, the GDP per capita on the Arizona side of the border was roughly $30,000. So still much poorer than the United States overall, which has a GDP per capita overall of something like $60,000. But to compare that to the southern side of the wall, where the GDP per capita is about $10,000 US a year. So it's about 3 times the size. You see similar huge gaps when you look at life expectancy, infant mortality, literacy rates, children in school, people that have obtained a high school diploma, etc. In other words, along a range of health, social, and economic outcomes, there's huge differences to being being either born or living on one side of this fence versus the other. Now, Jim Robinson and Darren Smoglu say that the explanation, the thing that drives this, the difference is the institutions. And the institutional quality on the north side of the border is so much stronger than the south side of the border that you're better able to form businesses, negotiate contracts, get high quality education, etc. Right? And because of those institutions, people are able to unlock their human capital, or so the story goes. Now, what they use this to say is what we should care about is whether or not countries are able to form what they call, inclusive institutions. Now, inclusive institutions, they say, are that these are institutions that feature secure property rights, unbiased systems of law, provisions of public services, and creates a level playing field in which people can exchange and contract. Now, they contrast this to extractive institutions. And extractive institutions, as they argue, are institutions where the elite find ways to get all of the surplus away from people with less power in society, the relatively poor. And so societies where there's a rich elite that owns the land, the means of production, that doesn't care about educating people that are less economically well off, or that are part of ethnic or religious or gender minority groups. Now, the example that they have is to say, if you have two countries where two girls are born, and in the one country, a girl is born and has no opportunity to get an education, she can't choose whether or not to work or to start a family or who to start that family with, isn't able to start a business, etc. And then compare that to a society where that same girl would be born, but is able to get an education, to make choices about her own life. If she wants to start a business, to be able to do so, to be able to form contracts that will be enforced to honor that business, and that the marketplace will be competitive and not full of cartels that shut her out, etc. And what they say is that second country, on average, is going to grow so much faster because they're unlocking the human capital of their population. And so what we need to do is to create all of the institutions, systems of public goods, health, education, rule of law, independent courts, etc., that make that possible. Right, so we need to create these countries. Now, this research program that the political economy has created, that's most closely associated with Acemoglu and Robinson, but so many other prominent economists have participated in, have found many empirical results consistent with this intuitively appealing and strong, powerful basic claim. So for instance, this is a paper in the Journal of Political Economy, I think it just last year, maybe 2 years ago now, that Acemoglu, Robinson, Johnson, and Suresh Naidu published on whether or not democracy causes economic growth. And what they say is if you look at the years around democratization, typically countries, something's going wrong before you radically shift your government and have a huge change. And so you see change in GDP per capita going down. But after you switch to democracy, this goes up over time. So they make the claim that democratization has this power of unlocking economic potential and economic growth. Now, here's the problem that we actually just learned about perfectly from Niels' presentation, which is, first, democracy is an outcome itself, right? And so it's easy to say that democracy creates economic growth, but the question that we should be interested in is, how do you create democracy? What is it that you can do to ensure that your country is more democratic? Just finding a measure of democracy, and as we just heard, there's many and they're mostly flawed, are outcome measures that researchers code looking back ex post. And so you can see a country like the United States and think, oh, they had Trump elected, they must be worse, or this person was elected, it must be better. But these are researchers coding it with the information. The relevant question for policymakers is not how ex post we code these things and whether or not we can create correlations that match economic growth in some way. It's if someone's drafting a constitution or creating a new set of laws or creating a new set of rules, what do you write down, right? What do you put in your constitution to ensure that there will be fairer elections or more independent courts? And here's the question that we actually don't have an answer to at all. So for instance, Acemoglu, Robinson, and others often focus on independent courts as a key institution of institutions. But the most basic questions about how to create independent courts, we don't know the answer to. So for instance, Should you have term limits for the judges on your apex court, on your Supreme Court? We don't know. Should it be few judges or many judges? We don't know. How should they be picked? Through a political process or independent experts? No one seems to know. And so the result is we can tell you it would be better if your courts were good, but we can't tell you ex ante what to do concretely to create that. And unfortunately, the places where we've started to look for these patterns have not been particularly promising. So for instance, a key feature that I just mentioned of inclusive institutions is the provision of public goods that allow people to uncloak their human capital, like better healthcare and better education. Here's the share of countries that include rights to healthcare and education in their constitutions from 1945 to 2016. You're now at something like 80% of countries have a right to education formally written in their constitution. And I think it's something like 60%, looking at this graph, have a right to healthcare. Here's the change in spending as a percent of GDP on these outcomes before and after adopting these rights. It's totally flat. It's totally flat if you look at literacy rates, healthcare outcomes, anything you can throw at it from the World Development Indicators, you can't find a change. And so we can tell you, have better education, have better healthcare, but we can't find yet the thing that you can write down ex ante in your laws that has a predictable relationship with that. Same thing I mentioned briefly, women's rights and unlocking the potential of women. This is the right to gender equality in constitutions and the historical gender equality index, which takes the World Development Indicators and just shows how women do as a percent of men. And so life expectancy, infant mortality, labor force employment, education outcomes, and then just sees the share that women do as well as men. So over time, this has gotten better, that women do about 65% as well as men on many of these indicators now, up from roughly 60% 50 years ago. No seeming correlations to the adoption of constitutional provisions. Now, part of this is certainly, like Stefan said, that we just don't know how to code all of the informal institutions and what it is, these other sub pieces. And it's also that the written constitution is not a great reflector of a country's true constitution. For instance, constitutions frequently have judicial opinions, customs, practices, treaties that all form part of their highest order law. That's not actually written in the document that we call a constitution, or it's not easy to code or easy to find for researchers like us. But on top of that, there's just a fundamental problem we don't have a great answer to as researchers of how to think about coding these things across countries. So for instance, we could use a so-called entrenchment approach, where we say, if you have a rule that is tough to amend, then that's a higher order law about the rights of women or about educational rights, etc. But then it just becomes a question, what does it mean to be entrenched? Is it the formal constitutional rules? Some countries have very high thresholds to amend their laws, yet they do it all the time. Other countries have low thresholds to amend their laws and they never do it. So what it means to be entrenched is tough to know. You could use external approaches and you could just ask, does this country in any place in a treaty, in a constitution, have a right to education? And that might give you some answer. Or an internal approach and just say, do people in the country say they have these rights or these rules, etc. The point is, we don't know what criteria we should be using to code these laws. We aren't able to do it in a particularly nuanced way. And then the consequence is we don't know ex ante what creates strong institutions like democratic outcomes, independent courts, greater spending and emphasis on education and healthcare, etc. Now, I think it's possible to then be a bit of a nihilist and think, well, if it's tough to measure and we haven't figured it out yet, we should throw away the effort. But the thing I think that's important to remember is serious attempts to try to measure institutions, legal forms, comparative laws across countries are at most about 20 years old. And we're just getting up to speed on this. And it's taking time for more new researchers to start their careers focusing on these topics. And as we do, people will come along and point out that the people on this call that have been doing this in the past have been silly, missed everything, done things wildly incorrectly, and hopefully in the forward make progress on these questions. But for now, we don't have great traction on measuring the de jure institutions that create the de facto changes in people's life outcomes that we care about. All right, I'll stop there. I need to.
Thank you very much, Adam. Thank you for these three very enlightening and interesting discussions. And we're seeing here that there are certainly some commonalities here. You're talking about what is it we measure? Can we measure different things? Are we measuring the wrong things and thereby not seeing exactly what it is we want to see at the other end, or the outcome? And also, are we measuring too broadly or perhaps too narrowly? Or as we heard here before, is it informal versus informal? These are some of the aspects here that I think that you all brought up, and I would just like to open the floor for the three of you to sort of dig deeper into these ones. Stefan, had your hand up first, so you get to start.
Yeah, thanks. So this is interesting, and I'd like to make just 2 or 3 remarks on the 2 other presentations. So with regard to Niels, I think actually he talked a lot more about how to define democracy rather than how to measure it. Now, obviously, your definition of democracy will impact on how you measure it, but I think still these are 2 different questions. And to be honest with you, I think democracy as such is not an institution. At least, if we follow one of the definitions that has been offered or that has been in use by the new institutional economists, it would be made up of a multitude of institutions. You can have a presidential system, you can have a parliamentary system, you can have first past the post, you can have proportional representation, you can have an election period of 4 years or 5 years. You can have, there are hundreds of differences. And I'm wondering whether it's so interesting to talk of democracy as a institution. So in that sense, I'm a lot more positive, and I'm probably also more optimistic than Adam regarding the measurability of democracy. I mean, there is the Varieties of Democracy project, which does have its shortcomings, Adam. But I think, what they've been doing is that there is really hundreds of variables. True, they have been, they have been given to countries ex post. These people who whatever coded Germany in 1923 knew that 10 years later there were the Nazis taking over. I completely agree with that. But there are so many detailed variables in the Varieties of Democracy project. So I think really measuring democracy is really not the most pressing challenge that we face. And now to continue with my optimism, also with regard to Adam, I think we know probably a little bit more than you admit, and obviously your work has also helped to that we know a little bit more about what works and what does not work. I think we have some ideas how to set up a judiciary that is actually independent. We know sort of the most relevant traits, and so we do have at least some ideas here. Also, in terms of constitutional compliance in general, I think we have a number of ideas telling us what does not work, right? If the Constitution tries to create paradise on earth, this is unlikely to work. If the means that a country has at its disposal simply are not sufficient to guarantee everybody a place in heaven, well, then you shouldn't promise a place in heaven. And so I think there are a couple of things that make me more optimistic probably than Adam. We know to establish the connection between sort of the informal parts that I talked about and constitutional reality. We seem to know at least that some informal traits, such as the degree of individualism that is found among the members of society, does have implications on the degree to which they are able to monitor their politicians. In other words, it has an impact on the degree to which de jure constitutional rules are actually being complied with. Full stop.
I think, Stefan, you commented both on Adam and Niels here, so whoever feels ready to jump in. Niels?
Yeah, thank you, Stefan. I think I agree with much of what you've said. just on, of course, I talked more about definition, but I think definition is the important first step. You know, I'm a lawyer. As lawyers, we make definitions as an important first step before you can actually measure something. And if you don't do the definition, and especially if you then look at, I mean, what most social scientists who measure the impact of democracy on other institutions, for example, or the influence of other institutions on democracy, they don't construct these indicators themselves, but they make use of certain indicators that have been constructed by others, like, for example, the Polity 5 index. And then you have to be aware that, of course, this Polity 5 index is a certain definition of democracy. And I think we would be much further if, as you suggest, we maybe have a more differentiated approach and say, okay, it's not just democracy that we are measuring, but we want to know the impact of certain kinds of democracy, maybe presidential democracy, maybe parliamentary democracy. Similarly, that we want to see from Adam's presentation. So maybe including equality right in a constitution as such doesn't make a difference. But if we pair it with other with other institutions like, I don't know, independent courts or anything, then this maybe it makes a difference, maybe it doesn't make a difference. So I guess it's an appeal to have more differentiated views on certain institutions, and I think that's perfectly correct, Stefan. But most of the literature that I'm seeing, and maybe I'm not the best expert here, is still looks at institutions from a very abstract point of view. Maybe that's also because you have to have a certain number of observations, and the more fine-grained you differentiate institutions, of course, the smaller the number of observations gets, and we only have 198 states or so. And then at some point we get to a number where we don't have enough observations anymore to make a meaningful quantitative comparison. But I think having a more differentiated view, I guess, would bring research a big step forward.
Yeah, Adam.
So I'm in agreement with a lot of what was said, and specifically I want to note a few things, which is Stefan pointed out that democracy itself is not an institution, and I think this is a mistake that is made. I think the right way to think about democracy is to think of it like something like capitalism or socialism, in that institutions can try to create more capitalistic societies or less capitalistic societies. They can have within the institution rules that are more capitalistic or more socialist, in the way that you can have within an institution rules that are more democratic or less. And the goal of those institutions can be to create democracy. But the democracy itself, whether or not Norway is a democracy and North Korea is not, that's not the institution, right? The institution, exactly like Stefan said, is a parliament and a president and a set of courts and a central bank and whatever these actual concrete things are that have people that work there and buildings and rules. Those are the institutions. And that's what we need to be able to figure out how to measure, is the properties of those features that then make a country more or less democratic or more or less autocratic or more or less capitalistic or whatever kind of outcome that we're hoping for. And that's where I worry that sometimes we skip the step and say, look, for instance, democracies trade more, have less war, have higher GDP growth, have better women's rights, et cetera. Therefore, let's be democracy. But what you concretely tell Afghanistan or Libya to put into their constitution is just a different question than to tell them, hey, you should be a democracy now. And it's that's the question that we need to spend more time on. And the problem that exists is, as far as I can tell, economists spend almost no time on that question. And there's a handful of us that are mostly associated with law schools or the law and economics movement that spend time on it, but it's relatively few people around the world that are interested in that other question about how to link to outcomes. And then to one other thing to what Stefan said, I agree. We actually are knowing more and more about what doesn't work and some about what does work, but it's still a little bit less about what does work. And part of the reason we know relatively less about what works is related to, or maybe a corollary to a point that Niels was just making, which is you can put formal rights, let's say, into a constitution, but what might matter is the right plus independent judiciary, or what might matter is an informal norm plus a parliamentary system plus something else, right? And the problem that we have as empirical researchers is that those are conditional results, they're interactions. And the amount of statistical power you need to precisely estimate an interaction is dramatically larger. It's like 16 times larger than the unconditional effect. And when we have, 190 countries, many of whom are doing weird things, the set of countries where we can actually draw these inferences is relatively small. And so we might be able to say something like having A plus B makes you 8% more likely to achieve Y. But if you're like Chile right now rewriting their constitution, what they don't want to be told is that there's a 4% effect some of the time, right? They want to know what's going to reduce inequality as they redraft their constitution. And researchers are like, oh, I found a 5% effect in a paper measured with this subset of countries. That's not really perfect information for them. So what I'm saying is not that we don't have some results that work some of the time in certain cases. It's just the kind of confidence you would need to tell people how to reshape their institutions or how to draft their constitutions. I don't think we're at that point, given the kind of humility we'd have to have, given all of the cultural differences across countries, historical factors, et cetera, to be able to draw those conclusions.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Something I'd like to know a little bit more about these dynamics. Now, we've focused very much on constitutions and very much of the formal side, but it has been mentioned here also with the possible conflicts that there could be between informal and formal institutions, and drawing a little bit on what Adam was saying here as well, also during your presentation, that if you want to give some kind of policy implications or telling Chile what to do, how do you then sort of get to the core of the informal institutions that very well could be there as a block to this, or could be a driving force as well, but they're not really seen. And then of course it does become important of how we measure them and how we can sort of capture these informal institutions and their role in that development process, or equalizing rights between men and women, etc. Stefan?
Yeah, I think that this is sort of really one of the core questions. I mean, how to make formal rules compatible with the informal rules. And Chile is interesting, is highly interesting in the sense that in their constitutional assembly, I think 16% of all representatives are from indigenous groups. So in other words, the likelihood that these indigenous groups will basically coordinate their behavior on rules that are slightly different from the non-indigenous population is at least larger than zero. So in other words, it ought to be taken into account somehow. And if at the end of the day it's true that conflicts between internal and external, or informal and formal institutions basically increase transaction costs and it basically create additional frictions, which basically hinders development or reduces the speed of development, then I think this is at least a key question. And now we are then the next question would be, so what exactly would you do? And I think it's really important to basically try to take the social norms that have been sort of helping these indigenous communities to coordinate their behavior as seriously into account as possible, and basically try to find ways in which formal institutions that the assembly would like to basically give to Chile, that doesn't completely contradict these informal rules that have been followed by the indigenous people there.
Niels?
I believe that's an important point, this interaction between formal and informal rules. I think it's often overlooked, and especially from my profession, I can say as lawyers, we often believe that if we have formal rules, then basically the informal rules will follow the formal rules, which probably often is not the case. I'm not sure whether Stefan's proposal to be aware of the informal rules and shape the formal rules according to the informal ones, that might work in some cases, but in other cases we might have normative problems with the informal rules, and then of course the question is, isn't there a way how we can influence informal rules with formal ones? I have a doctoral student who is working on the topic, and one of a big examples is the dowry practice in India, which is a normatively problematic practice because it has all kinds of negative consequences for women, but just prohibiting it doesn't work because there's still a strong informal rule, which leads to families still practicing, still continuing with this practice, and maybe even the practice increasing. So basically we have to take into account these informal rules, but probably we shouldn't just say, okay, the formal rules should acknowledge them because we have a normative problem with the informal rules. So I also don't know how to resolve the problem, but I believe it's an important question to have a look at, and to see that there may be different interactions. In some cases, it might work if we adapt formal rules to the informal ones, and other ones, we might actually want to change the informal ones for normative reasons, but then we have to see how to do it in a clever manner.
Any further comments on that?
Yeah, I guess I can jump in. This is perhaps repetitive of other points, but I'm in complete agreement the need to get to informal rules. And for instance, just as another anecdote on this, which is growing up in the United States all through elementary school and high school, the way that sort of the vision of the world is like the US is a democratic country where we have elections and a Congress and a president, and the people decide what happens. And these other countries, China and Russia, these are or North Korea, there are autocracies where just one evil dictator person is in charge and they boss everybody around. And then and you think, oh, just don't have rules that put one person in charge so they can boss everyone around. But then when you get to the case, for instance, of Russia, the Russian constitution creates electoral assemblies, has formal rights, elections, etc. That are part of the constitution. But of course, I don't think most of us think that free speech in Russia is the same as it is in Germany or the UK or the United States, and we don't think that that the elections are free and fair in the same way. But frequently, what takes place is it's the use of the formal institutions in ways that corrupt these processes. For instance, many countries have rules that if you've committed certain crimes, you can't run for president again. This is coming up right now in the United States as there's various efforts to charge Donald Trump with various forms of insurrection or treason for the events on January 6th. Other countries have those same rules. If you commit treason, you can't run for president. It just so happens that if you're Russia or whoever else, you can use those rules to prosecute your political enemies. And so part of what matters is the informal institutions, practices, culture, professional ethics, whatever it may be, that lead to the use of these rules being fair-minded in some way. And so it does take combining the de jure rules, the informal institutions, to have an understanding of these de facto outcomes. And I think all three of these pieces, the de facto outcomes we're getting better at measuring, the de jure rules we're getting better at measuring, and I think where this discussion highlighted is these informal pieces we're getting better at measuring, but that's lagged, I think, so far the other two. But at this point, I feel like I'm perhaps repeating some of the same earlier point.
May I just make a quick remark on that?
Yeah.
Okay, because I think this normative issue is important, and we should. My plea would be that we should be humble. I mean, I am in favor of the rule of law. I am in favor of democracy. I'm in favor of equal rights, whatever. But so I have problems with the dowry. I have problems with whatever, female genital cutting, etc. But we need to acknowledge the difficulty in changing these informal institutions in the first place. And we also need to acknowledge that our normative system might not be the only normative system around in the world. So I think it's important to be humble there. The United States tried to give Iraq a rule of law constitution. Didn't really work. So it was the attempt to apply Western normative standards to a non-Western country. It didn't work. And my fear is that it might not work in many other cases either. So I think, yes, trying to stop the norms underlying female genital cutting might be worth the while, but it's it's a true challenge. It cannot be done by just writing one line in a constitution. That will not work in all likelihood.
Thank you for that. I think we should open the floor now. I have a number of questions already. Let's keep them fairly short and to the point. I would start with Arthur Wilson.
Thank you. Firstly, I should say I'm very much a rookie in all of this. I'm hoping to learn from all of you. And so what I say maybe is more safely ignored than some other comments, perhaps. But I'm struck by the focus on nation states with all three speakers. And I don't know why that should be. It strikes me that, to think of Nogales, New Mexico, that area, the differences, again, I grew up in Chicago. The differences between the north and the south side of Chicago are, I think, comparable in magnitude and perhaps greater if you measure it in terms of income, than the differences between the Mexican and the US side of Nogales. And I don't know why are we focusing on the nation rather than on some other category. The second concern is that we really need to also pay attention to interactions between entities. One of my colleagues from Lithuania made the point that he asserted that Lithuania can never be free because it's next to Russia. There's of course the famous joke about, Mexico, poor Mexico, so far from God and so close to the United States. I think we need to pay attention to the interaction. And as I look at it, it kind of feels like trying to invent microeconomics given what we know about macroeconomics. I think it's likely to be much more productive to focus on smaller interactions, smaller entities, less non-national interactions, and then build up from there. And again, if you want to ignore all of that, feel free. I'm done.
Right. Jumping on that. So the two thoughts. So the first thought, I think the focus on the nation state to make these comparisons and as the unit of study is probably a product of the three panelists that happen to be chosen, that all of us have an interest in comparative law and comparative institutions. And the overwhelming focus, I think, is of people studying their own country or a handful of commonly studied countries. So there's, for instance, dramatically more people that are researching policing in the United States than people that are researching, democratization around the world or something like that. And so, at least on balance, your hope is correct. Now, I think that we should shift the focus more broadly into having at least a greater emphasis on studying countries around the world, and in part in that I think that there are important questions that are of first order importance that relatively few people are looking on, where some of the within country things, there's so much focus on it that we're like chasing the nth order effect that we actually do know more than the politicians are willing to do. Second thought on just the north and south side of Chicago. So I live on the north side of Chicago and work on the south side. So I'm very sympathetic to the point that there is great differences between the two. My colleague, Eric Posner, always uses this as an example when people talk about nation building in other countries. And he says, it's easy when you're sitting in a seminar room to think that some group of experts could go study what's going on in a foreign country and go into wherever, Nigeria, Myanmar, et cetera, and write a report and tell them what to do differently and help improve the situation. But just imagine for a second if a group of, Chinese or German or Nigerian experts came to Chicago and wrote a report on how to fix policing or education or whatever, do you really think anything could change as a result of some new insight from some set of outsiders? And no is the answer. It couldn't possibly think that that's what we're missing to solve these problems. They're too deep, too ingrained, lack of political will, lack of capacity, whatever it is. And it's not this lack of outsiders. So even within our own communities, I think that should lead us, as a few of my co-panelists have already said, to be humble in our thoughts and recommendations about these things.
Thank you. Anyone else wants to comment on that? Otherwise, I go on to Niels.
No, I totally agree with Adam. I think Arthur Wilson raised an important point, but it's really that our focus is more on nation states. That doesn't mean that other questions are unimportant, but I think that you really have to do both. So that's.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Arthur. Emanuela Carbonara. Yeah, yes, there you are.
Excellent. Hello, everybody. Thank you for these very, very interesting talks with lots of very good insights. So I got three little comments that first comment that sometimes reading the literature on institutions and growth, it seems to me that the empirical literature, it seems to me that there is a link. So basically good institutions seem to work in what we could term already good countries. So there would be, and this I'm very much in line with what Arthur was saying just a minute ago, that it seems that there is some kind of endogeneity, so that countries that are already intrinsically democratic, then democratic institutions seem to work very well, and other countries instead seem to stagger. And so I was thinking why that could be. One possibility is that, okay, we now look at this, we have these studies in which we count how many countries actually implement certain right protections in their constitutions, and we try to see whether that influences growth or not. And my impression is that many of these countries protecting these rights in their constitutions, like, right for education, IPRs and so on, have their constitution being transplanted and being recreated because they are somehow developing countries, so they are somehow changing their institutions. And so there might be that actually in these countries, these rights don't really work well because there are informal institutions, or also it might also be because it's not the right moment for them to have those kind of institutions, because it's not given that certain institutions, it's good for growth independently of the economic conditions of a particular country. My example, what I worked on is IPRs, for instance, protecting IPRs. We know that there are stages of development, and protection of IPRs helps in certain stages, but not in other stages. And that because protection of IPRs seems to be very good at fostering productivity and growth when in highly technological sectors, whereas there's not so good in low-tech sectors. And so if the economy of a country is made of low-tech sectors, possibly the introduction of IPR protection de facto and de jure might be detrimental, or might have the desired effect in that moment. And then I have a question, which came to my mind looking at one of the slides that Adam showed us about the effect of democratization, where we have that growth was decreasing in the 10-15 years before democratization, and then there is a change in regime, and then you have an increase. But then it seems to be in the last 20 years that increase has been having, let's say some fluctuation around the trend, some fluctuations. And so could it be that at some point, democracy stops having a good effect on economic growth? And that might actually explain the crisis we are seeing now. That's exactly Okay, looking at, after 20, 25, 30 years, it seems to be that there is some kind of trend. Is that because, it might be reflecting the crisis we have seen in the latest years from 2008 onward, but it might also be something more general, so that at some point, certain democratic institutions stop really protecting the rights or stop protecting the economic rights that guarantee growth. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think we collect a few of the questions here now. So we also take the questions from Chanir Bakir and from Nadia von Jacobi. So if we start with you, Chanir. No.
I can start while Chanir is next. So thank you very much for this very interesting debate in which you showed us, and I'm here with some PhD students from a doctoral program in law, ethics, and economics. So it is very interesting to listen to you also. And I think you put it very much to the forefront what the key challenges are, right? So I would like to make a kind of radical suggestion regarding our common agenda, right, on these issues of measuring institutions, because I've noticed in your talks that there were sentences like, these people want to know what to put in a constitution, right? And we want to know what a 5% effect of this particular solution is, or of this element. But then Stefan proposes that formal institutions must be compatible basically with informal institutions unless we don't want a failure ex ante. But on the other hand, there's also the issue of how to change informal institutions, which is of course always an issue, right, of change and of development and of progress. So my question is, shouldn't we all focus our research agendas much more on process rather than on content? Shouldn't we try and investigate what is the process to identify the right degree of legitimacy of the formal solution vis-a-vis a contextual informal setup? Because if we combine insights from the lab, from comparative law, and from all our different perspectives, but we focus on the process to identify the right solution instead of focusing always on the specific mix of solutions, right? So it's this law and this formal rule together. What do you think? Is that feasible? Would it change the kind of output and the insights that we find?
Thank you, Nadia. Chanir Bakir, are you there? No. I think we can start with what we have now, and then so first the reactions to Manuela before, and then also to her question, but also Nadia's questions and suggestions. I think Adam, your hand was up first.
Great, thank you. Thanks for these great points. So I heard 4 points across the 2 questions, so I'll briefly respond to them. So the first point was that, is it possible that some of these institutions are endogenous in various ways? So democratic countries have good economic outcomes, but it's maybe not necessarily about the democracy, but what kind of countries happen to be democracies, or et cetera. I think this is plausible and a real concern for the study of institutions. One key example of this is the legal origins literature. So the legal origins literature looked at, or still looks at, whether or not countries have civil law or common law traditions, and then the impact of those legal traditions on contemporaneous outcomes like property rights, economic growth, et cetera. And now at first, the key finding of that literature is that common law systems do better than civil law systems. That outcome has gotten murkier when people started to just say that, for instance, that British Commonwealth countries, that basically to way oversimplify, the British colonized pieces of land that were more valuable or something like this, better environmental endowments, more developed, whatever it may be. And so it might not be anything about the British common law, just like if you get there first and get a piece of land where there's less disease burden than a French civil law country, you're going to have better outcomes later, et cetera. And so now the relationship between these things has become much murkier, and we're less certain about the differences. And for instance, it's not obvious actually the countries that we call civil and common law actually have that many differences in substantive laws. And so, which is one thing that I've worked on researching. And as a result, we can label countries in these ways, but what we mean when we say that label is less well known. The second point was on transplants. And maybe it's the case that just taking one set of ideas and importing them into a setting that where they're not part of the local tradition or customs or history, or people aren't ready for it, might not work particularly well. First, I think that is quite plausibly right that the legal transplants don't always work super well. On top of this, though, one finding that is proven to create one thing I think we know, to get to what Stefan's done, is that often that small changes work better than big changes. So if you blow everything up in your institutions and your constitutions, that can be really disruptive for society. But of course, at the moment where people have just had a revolution or big protests or whatever, people don't want to hear, let's make 3 changes. They want to like radically transform the institutions of the country. And so it's not just that transplants don't necessarily work, it's that radical changes away from the status quo, whether or not they're driven domestically or foreignly, often don't particularly work. Now, the third question was, what about this democratic slowdown? What could be explaining it? Now, first I'll say this is, a lot could be going on. It could just be, the 2008 slowdown. It could be the set of countries in the sample. But there's one argument that Maker, Olson, and all of the sort of old school neoclassical economists frequently make about this, which is what they say is that within stable democracies, over time, interest groups build up. And this creates sort of institutional sclerosis. And so the example that people give is like housing markets in cities like San Francisco, where at some point that's a vibrant economy, but over time, various groups build up, and now it's impossible to build anything. And it's very difficult to get things done. Or New York City, where it costs billions of dollars to extend the Second Avenue subway, why a couple of blocks cost more than the initial building of the subway system. And that is over time a variety of regulations, interest groups, things that might build up over time. Now, the final question was about, should we study process? There has been a turn in the comparative constitutions literature, at least, to look at studying whether or not more participatory processes lead to better constitutional outcomes. And the initial results of that research is, I think, all quite encouraging or promising. Now, I think that's one lesson that constitution makers have really taken to heart in examples like Chile that we talked about, where people set up commissions with elections that have hearing panels that listen to everyone that wants to say anything, that can submit comments, et cetera, to create these maximally participatory processes. I don't know if that's actually going to work or how well it's going to work going forward, but there's at least some evidence that that has worked. And I do think that that might be a good locus of focus of how to get right the balance of creating the institutions to create institutions is a good focus of research.
Thank you, Adam. Stefan, are you?
Yes, please. Yeah, so thanks for all the questions. That they are definitely interesting. Just a very tiny little remark towards Arthur. Actually, my presentation was not meant to be on the nation state level. It was meant to be a lot lower, right? I mean, I showed you all these Italian regions, so it was the Italian regional level rather than the nation state level. Second remark on Emanuela. Actually, I want to basically carry on with what Adam said on Mansur Olson. I mean, Emanuela, you know the book Rise and Decline of Nations, 1982, by Mansur Olson, in which he basically makes exactly the argument that Adam just repeated, right? So over time, there will be more interest groups. These interest groups will lobby, they will ask, special favors, there will be rent seeking. And at the end of the day, the welfare increasing legislation will not be implementable or passable in parliament anymore. That's the idea. Now, if you look at the data, if you test that, it's a hard case to defend. For example, if you look into the Petersen-Tabellini set up where they look into the effects of economic effects of constitutional rules. And you just plug in an age of democracy variable, asking whether the age of democracy has any impact on the speed with which a country grows, that is overall productivity. What you find is that variable is highly significant and it's highly positive, okay? So in other words, there is no really convincing evidence that this is how should I put it, a secular problem. And then to Nadia's question, actually, I'm not entirely sure that I want to sort of reiterate what Adam said, but I want to talk a little bit about possible ways that one can think about inducing change towards informal institutions. Okay, and I think there is an interesting approach by Christina Bicchieri, who has looked into female genital cutting. So the question is, if you are the parents of a young girl, why would you basically do that to her? And what she does, what she asks is basically second order beliefs. So what she looks at is she asks people why they would be doing that. And then the answer often is, well, because we think that our neighbors think that we ought to do it. Okay, so they are completely convinced that this is baloney. They shouldn't be doing it. It's to the disadvantage of their girl. But they still do it because they think that others think that they should be doing it. Okay. So in other words, one way to think about inducing change into informal institutions that we normatively do not like is to basically talk about what are their consequences and talk about the beliefs that others have or might not have. And at the moment where everybody realizes I'm only doing it because I'm afraid to be looked at badly by my neighbors, but there is substantially no reason of doing this, such an informal institution or social norm might break down rather fast. Just a second example where I think this is really, really important. So there is talk of anti-social punishment. So anti-social punishment basically is that people who have cooperated in the first round of a game, say a prisoner's dilemma, are being punished because they have cooperated. Okay, they're not being punished because they have defected in the first round, but they're being punished because they are cooperators. Now, if you think for a second what this could mean for the development of societies, right? If you want to clean up a place, and because you want to clean it, that is, you cooperate, and because you are cleaning up a place, you are not being talked to anymore, or people don't invite you for dinner anymore. Okay, so in other words, sort of the incentives to cooperate are systematically driven out if you have antisocial punishment. Okay, so I think that the question is, how can you get a handle on this behavior, and how can you basically make the consequences of antisocial punishment norms, and they are fairly prevalent in parts of the world. How can you basically induce, and there I'm at your question, how can you start a process in enlightening people what the consequences of the anti-social punishment norms may mean for all of them? They will all be worse off. So it cannot be in the rational interest of people to basically keep up those norms. And I think it's also important to think about not only how we can write constitutions, but how we can think about inducing at least some change regarding informal norms.
Thank you, Stefan. I think, Niels, your hand went up and down a bit, but it's back up, so I'm giving you the word.
Just briefly, because much has already been said. On the democracy development question of Emanuela, I think we shouldn't read too much into this table. That might just be noise at the end. So we also have to see what the table is not showing. So it's not showing us the countries which have, it only shows us countries which have transited in the last 30 years. So I mean, that transited to democracy at some point. So a country like China wouldn't be in there. And of course, it doesn't show anything about countries which have transited to democracy already 150 years ago. So how the development goes further. So I guess it just might be noise. So I guess the table as such is just a spotlight on a certain development, but that doesn't mean that necessarily democracy has less influence on economic development after 30 years. I just wanted to respond to Stefan and the informal institutions. I mean, I think neighbors' perceptions is important, but probably it's a bit more complicated because there's often a moral value system behind it that justifies this practice, so that girls which in female genital mutilation, that girls that are not cut are considered to be unclean, and this practice is supported by mothers as well, who have to justify for themselves why they had to undergo this practice. And of course, if the moral value system breaks down, then for them to justify why they were actually subject to these procedures is much more difficult. So in order to stay coherent for their value system, they also have to, that it's important to achieve certain values, and it's important to also subject the daughter to this system, because otherwise you can't justify why you had to undergo the procedure yourself. So I believe that it's important to address the reasons behind the informal rules, but just being transparent about why and social pressure is an important point. But I guess it's not the only point.
May I very briefly respond? I completely agree. But somewhere we need to start about ways where we could have an impact. No, I completely agree in the sense that what we know, there's a recent paper a discussion paper by Becker, who is at Harvard, on the question in what regions of the world this is this plays a larger role. And the answer is where traditionally, historically, herding played a large role. That is, where men were away from home for months and months and months, and then they were putting pressure on their wives to get mutilated for obvious reasons. So there is a historical story to be told. I completely agree, but that doesn't imply that today that historical inheritance basically needs to be upkept.
Thank you very much. I know it's almost coming up to past now, but since we've got Bakker here now, I think we should give him a chance to ask his question.
Thank you so much, Tobias. I will be very brief, and thank you for this very interesting panel. I have one comment and one question. My comment is panelists have tendency to combine or conflate institutions and actors. For example, there were references to courts, political parties, central banks as concrete institutions. Actually, these are actors. And when we say institutions, we refer to rules of the game. And when we refer to actors, we refer to players of the game, quoting from Douglas North. And unless we pay attention to this distinction, then we will overlook their interactions, effects, relationships. So that's my comment. My question is, what is your understanding of culture? Is it a part of informal institution, or is it something much broader than informal institutions, within which a broader context, informal structural context, within which informal institutions are embedded and shaped? So this is my question. Thank you.
A very complicated question that warrants quick and succinct answers.
You want me to start? Well, first of all, I completely agree. Thanks for reminding us. Doug North makes a distinction between institutions and actors and organizations, however you want to frame them. I completely agree. The second question, actually, I know that there are others in the room who are also interested in this relationship between informal institutions on the one hand and culture on the other. And actually, at the end of the day, I'm not even sure if that distinction is really so important. It really depends on our research question. I mean, if I'm interested in, say, the relationship between formal and informal institutions, well, I can say, well, you know, all formal and informal institutions are part of culture, or at least some of them are, but that will not improve the quality of my answer. In other words, today at least I have written something else in one of my books, but today at least I would rather prefer to pass the question, because I'm not sure that, you know, any answer will help us answer the relevant questions more easily.
Well, thank you very much. And with that, I think we'll wrap this session up. So a big thank you to Stefan, Niels, and Adam for your presentations and for the discussion and also questions here. It was a pleasure having you with us today. I'm just going to say that WINIR has several other events planned, so stay tuned and see what we announce on our website, not least our large annual conference, which will take place in September online. But with that, I thank all of you very much. So thank you very much and have a good continuing of your day. Bye.